Welcome to the Fighting on Film podcast, the podcast all about classic and obscure war movies, from the Normandy landings to the days of chivalry and swords. If it's been captured on film, we're going to try and cover it. I'm Robbie of RM Military History.
I'm Matthew Moss of Historical Firearms and the Armourer's Bench.
Hello, welcome back to Fighting on Film. This week, we're taking a look at the recent Netflix film, Munich, the Edge of War. And we are joined by Wesley Livesay from the History of the Second World War podcast, who recently produced a 9-part series on the Munich Agreement. So who better to join us to get into this one? Wesley, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me here, letting me talk about movies for a bit. I love watching movies and I rarely get a chance to talk about them. And it just so happened that this came out, 2 weeks after my 9-part series on the Munich Agreement, which was not planned at all, but is interesting that it happened.
Really well timed.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Matt, do you want to talk us through cast? I'll do production and we'll get into the meat of it.
Sure. First, I'll note that the premise of the film is it's a fictional side story to the agreements that were signed in Munich in 1938. And it's got an interesting cast. I think it has a very strong cast in that it's both British and German. So we're drawing on two significant talent pools. The lead name associated with the film is Jeremy Irons, who has been in dozens of very good films. He's an accomplished character actor and very well known. And he is playing a role that physically he really suits because he has a very strong resemblance to Neville Chamberlain. But I think when it comes to his voice, not quite as much. He doesn't really have that soft-spoken, Midlands sort of. He's a bit too gruff, I think. What do you think?
He's too Jeremy Irons because he always sounds like Jeremy Irons, doesn't he? Like, unfortunately, I don't think he's ever done an accent.
That's kind of what I was thinking as well.
And it's a very recognizable voice, isn't it? Then next we have George MacKay, who probably is best known to those that enjoy the war movie genre as Private Schofield, or Lance Corporal Schofield, I think it was, from 1917. And before that, he'd been in Private Peaceful, another World War I movie. He's the British diplomat. I think he's supposed to be one of Chamberlain's private secretaries. He's tasked with a side mission, which we'll get more into in a moment.
I do have a comment on Mr. MacKay. I just have to comment and say that I love the fact that his very first words in the movie, while drunk, laying on some grass, are "I need to sleep." That's his very first line in the movie, and I was sitting in my house watching this movie. It was pretty late for me. I started at about 11 p.m. and just starting off with that as his first line just made me laugh out loud for a good few minutes.
Well, it's not. Let's say it isn't an omen for the film, but it is interesting. It does.
Well,
yeah. His opposite number in Germany is Paul van Hartmann, who's played by Jannis Niewöhner, and he's been in lots of German TV and films, all sorts of different things, lots of comedies, dramas, etc. And I think he plays this really rather well. Then we have an assorted cast of diplomats and secretaries, typists. Most notably, we have Ulrich Mathers playing Adolf Hitler, who has been in a number of films, and I think most notably Downfall from 2004, where he plays Joseph Goebbels. Yeah. And he's been in a couple of others, and he's very good, but he's not the spit for Hitler that he is for Goebbels, I would say. And he's got a very striking face, and it just doesn't quite match Bruno Ganz's performance.
Just works. I think it just works. Yeah. If you squint, but because he was such a good ringer for Goebbels in Downfall, it's really hard to not see it.
It is. It's hard to detach Downfall Goebbels from Munich Hitler. It's kind of
once you've seen Downfall, depictions of the Nazi hierarchy are really hard to sort of top because Downfall was so good.
Downfall is such a interesting film in the way that everyone is characterized, and that performance by Gans, Bruno Gans, is probably one of the best depictions of Hitler towards the end that you can imagine. I mean, Anthony Hopkins' performance in The Bunkers is pretty good.
I do find it interesting that what you mentioned about the face and the look, is confusing if you watch Downfall, especially if you watched it recently. But I do think that like his performance, other than that, I think that you mentioned Downfall a lot. And I think that in some ways, like the public perception of Downfall, and specifically like its most famous scene, you know, in the bunker with the yelling that became like an internet meme. Yeah. I think it's kind of in some ways like poisoned the depiction of Hitler, because this is much earlier than that, right? That is after 6 years of war. Whereas this is a very different Hitler that we see, and that, you know, people saw in 1938. You know, some of the traits were still there, but it's, you know, he's not a wild-eyed, bordering on like crazy person, basically, that he is, that you see in Downfall for a significant portion of it.
Absolutely. I think the main issue with my opinion on casting Mathers is that he doesn't have the youthfulness of a much younger Hitler, one that hasn't been, you know, under that stress of directing a war for 6 years. So I think he just looks a little bit too old. But I mean, the performance is good, which we'll come back to. Other characters, we have Sandra Huller as Helen Winter, who I believe has a much larger role in the books than she does in the film. We have Liv Lisa Fries, who plays Lena, who is a Jewish lady, the friend of both of the main characters. Her role is sadly quite compartmentalized to just being context, really, but there we are. Then we have August Diehl, who plays Franz Sauer, and he's probably best known to many as Major Hellstrom from Inglourious Bastards. He was also in Terrence Malick's Hidden Life, a film about a Catholic German who refuses to swear allegiance to Hitler, which is a very strong film. And most recently, he was Vladimir Lenin in The King's Men, which comes out, which came out earlier this year. Yeah.
Wow, I didn't know that.
We have Jessica Brown Findlay, who is probably best known from The Crown. She plays MacKay's wife, Pamela Leggett. And then we have a rounding out of Chamberlain's staff, and we have Alex Jennings as Sir Horace Wilson, who played the Colonel in the 2004 version of The Four Feathers, and is also in the upcoming Operation Mincemeat film as well. So not sure which role he's playing in that, but I believe he is in it. Then we have Nicholas Farrell, who played Sir Alex Cardigan, and he played Hugh Dowding in Hurricane. In 2018, he was in SSGB. He was in the 2014 BBC series about the lead up to World War One in 2014, 37 Days, where he played Ira Crow.
Was he not Ed in Toast as well? Because that's what I know him from. All these serious roles. I'm just here like, he's from that sitcom.
He was also the RAF squadron leader in Pearl Harbor as well.
No way. Oh, yeah,
he shouldn't have been, because that shouldn't have been in Pearl Harbor, but it was anyway. And then he was also in Breed of Heroes, which we've mentioned on a show and tell episode.
Yeah.
And then we had Mark Lewis Jones as Sir Osmond Cleverly, and he was been in lots of British TV, Soldier, Red Cap, that 37 Days series as well, the mini series I mentioned, and he was in Master and Commander in 2003. So there's some pedigree of British actors here that have been in some interesting war movies in the past, but it's a strong cast, and as I said, it's a nice balance between that German pool of actors and the UK.
They haven't loaded it with, you know, I know Jeremy Irons is a well-known actor, but they haven't loaded it with names. You know, the performances shine through. You're not just, you're not looking at, like, say, a Tom Hardy or a Robert Downey Jr. and just thinking, well, that's Robert Downey Jr. in a uniform. It's sort of, you can lose yourself in the characterization, which I think kind of helped this movie a little bit.
Some of them I certainly would have liked to have seen more of, to be honest. I think that's one thing that we'll come back to when we discuss the agreement scenes and the actual negotiations, etc.
100%. I'll go into production a little bit now. So it was a Netflix film, came out days before we recorded this show. So depending when you're listening to it'll be out there, hot on the heels, yeah. And it was co-created by Turbine Studios. Obviously, as Matt mentioned, based on the book by Robert Harris. He wrote Fatherland, and most recently he wrote a book called V2. And the screenplay was written by Ben Power and Robert Harris also had a writing credit. Working title was Munich 38, but was changed to The Edge of War. And it was directed by a German director called Christian Schwochow, known for his work on German TV and films, a mini-series called The Tower, which is about life in GDR-era Dresden. And most recently, he directed a couple of episodes of The Crown, and cinematography was by Frank Lahm. He's another German crew member. There's a lot of German, obviously, involvement in this movie. And he's worked with Schwochow on Bad Banks as a Netflix series, and he's worked heavily on German TV, and he also did the cinematography on the Crown episodes that Christian did. So there's a lot of collaboration.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And there's a British connection for the music. So it was by Isabel Waller-Bridger, who is Phoebe's sister. And she's worked on, and she's worked on BBC's War and Peace in 2016, episodes of Black Mirror, and Vanity Fair for ITV. So she's, got a good pedigree for doing quite, drama-y musical composing. And it was filmed in location in Munich, in Potsdam, and in Liverpool.
It was. I was like,
yeah.
I was doing the Leo pointing at the TV screen meme
Leo
quite a number of times.
Every week. It's becoming a thing. So as this week, obviously, retro reviews, I mean, we're hot on the heels of the movie, so there are no genuine retro reviews. So we thought we'd try something a little bit different. So if you're active on our Twitter, do follow us at Fighting on Film. And we put a post up asking for one-word reviews. So here are some that I picked out. Brian Moran said, meh. Benji Lee had 2 words, but I couldn't leave it out. He said, skinny Hitler. Thomas McCall said, compelling. David Patterson said, too long, but he wrote it as 1 word. John Evans
smooth.
said,
very good.
Yeah, smooth. This one's even smoother. John Evans said, appeasement. I quite liked. Yeah, it was juicy. And Dave Coe said, decent. So it's quite a mixed bag, I think, really.
I think a lot of people, either found it either too long or enjoyed it. I think that's the thing. I don't know what everyone went into the film expecting. I was hoping I knew it was going to be fictionalized from an adaptation. So I wasn't expecting like a blow by blow recreation of the negotiations in Munich, etc. But I was hoping for a little bit more of that meat. I don't know about you, Wesley.
Absolutely. I think I also had no expectations. I haven't read the book or anything like that.
No, I haven't either.
I'd seen the trailers. I'd watched the trailers before I watched the movie. I was hoping that, I guess we'll get into this a little bit more in the plot, but I was kind of hoping that the fictional and fact storylines that are happening throughout this thing were a bit more intertwined instead of like almost happening totally apart from each other, except for one very specific moment. Beyond that, I didn't have many quality expectations. Actually, it's probably better than I was planning it being. But
I hadn't read the book either. So from the trailer, it was definitely, I mean, trailers are guilty for this anyway, but it made it look a bit more punchy than necessarily what we got. You got the shot of George MacKay, because it's George MacKay, you have to have a shot of him running, like, because he did it in 1917, so he has to do it in every other film he's in.
He runs so well, though. That's the thing.
He's such a great runner. So it's like
he's a cinematic runner.
Yeah. So it had that interspersed with like Chamberlain and Hitler, and I was like, oh, has he got to deliver this document? Like, and he's running, trying to, sort things out, but it didn't pan out like that, and I was just a little bit like, oh, I wanted more edge of my seat. Will they avert the war or not? Because it's fiction, they can go whatever way they want to go, and in the end you get a pretty by numbers sort of espionage-y, politically thriller hybrid.
I'd be really curious to know, obviously all 3 of us come into this with I would say a far above average knowledge about what actually happens in history around this agreement and what happens afterwards. I would be curious to know viewers who have essentially no knowledge of history, or certainly like don't know how the story's going to go, what they would think of it. Like, I wonder how much of the like tension is robbed from the fact that we kind of know the beats of the story, assuming that it doesn't go totally fictional.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Interesting. And my mum, she messaged me after she'd seen it, she messaged me in the evening, and she was like, "Oh, that boy should have shot him. That boy." Spoiler alert: there's a character who Von Hartmann is in a room with Hitler, and he's got this little Fabrique Nationale pistol.
Look at Rob throwing out his knowledge.
I know, yeah, exactly. I watch thearmorsbench.com. So is it, is he going to shoot Hitler or not? And sort of it pans out that he doesn't. And me and my mum got into this discussion of, would it have been better for Europe if he had done that? And I was saying, well, who's to say someone didn't take Hitler's place and committed worse atrocities, or, who's to say? And I thought that was quite interesting. So the movie throws up interesting what ifs. The plot is using dramatic license anyway. Could we not have had a bang, shoots Hitler? Oh my God, that would have been a real twist. As we don't. I was like, well, I know he doesn't shoot him, so this scene is a little bit irrelevant.
Yeah.
Almost.
Well, that's very true. And there was a moment where I thought that having not read the book, I thought, are they going to go full Inglourious Bastards with this and do an alt history sort of moment where he does shoot Hitler? And then when that didn't occur, my expectation of the tension then shifted, knowing that there was another at least 25 minutes of the film left. Is he going to get away with this? Is he going to escape? Because we have that whole setup with August Diehl's character where he kind of realizes that he's up to no good with MacKay Leggett. And I was wondering, is he going to have to escape? Is he under suspicion now? Yeah. Is there going to be more of this? But there wasn't. That just sort of ebbed away. There was a conversation with Frau Winter about, are you going to continue to be an opposition to the Nazis? And he just says, yes, I have nothing else to do. I did think that whole scene where he doesn't shoot Hitler, this is a spoiler review, by the way, guys, if you probably realized that by now, I thought it was such an interesting human moment where someone was incapable of carrying out what they had hoped to do, because he was faced with the reality of having to shoot a man face to face. He knows what this man is capable of, but he doesn't know about the Holocaust. He doesn't know what's coming. He doesn't know about the war that is going to engulf Europe. Yeah. So he's weighing up, this man is very unpleasant and he has designs on starting a major war in Europe, but can I justify shooting him? And he has that doubt. Maybe it's a lack of capability within, I guess. It's that kind of situation. You wouldn't know what you would do unless you were in that situation. And that was something I did like. And that made me think, like, if I was in that position, would I shoot Hitler? Knowing what he knew, that character.
Really like that scene, if only because I feel like Paul is the strongest character in the movie. And so I really like that he had that scene, and that
other than Irons, he's the character with the most conviction, I think.
Yeah. And in that scene, like, it doesn't, like, it's just him in the room. He says some lines, but they're not about what he's doing while Hitler is talking to him. And you can tell what's going through his mind. You can feel why he's not doing it, why he wants to do it. And kind of in that moment, I thought they did a pretty good job.
Yeah, I agree. One of the strongest scenes in the film.
I think his arc as well is the most interesting arc, because he's lost the most out of all of the like friendship group. Obviously spoiler again, the girl, she's found out to be Jewish. Yeah. She's horribly mistreated in prison. She's thrown from a window and she's in this sort of coma type.
Yeah, like catatonic, isn't she?
Catatonic state, yeah. And he's saying how, like, I thought the Nazis were going to improve my country. Look at what they've done, or look at what they're going to do. And his arc is actually, he's lost so much. He's not only lost his friends, but he's also lost something that he believed in. Like, and he put all his eggs in one basket. So for him to have that opportunity to confront the man that saw as some sort of like God type character, some redeemer, some great redeemer, to have that opportunity is really interesting. But we know that doesn't happen. So it's like, I'm conflicted.
I thought by contrast that MacKay's character had very little in the game.
Yes.
He has the least conviction behind him. He doesn't seem particularly bothered about what Hitler represents or what is going to happen in Europe. He's just swept along as a functionary, I think would be fair to say. And that might be a fairly accurate representation of some of those staff members in 37, 38, where they're just working through the cogs of politics.
I think it suits the character because obviously when he's trying, I mean, we're going more broad now, but when he's trying to sort of persuade Chamberlain to let him in the room and stuff, it's very sort of, oh, can I introduce you to this man? He's really important. He's going to show you this document. And Chamberlain's like, well, okay, like, it's obviously, it's the dynamic there between, boss and subordinate, I think worked quite well. As little as MacKay had to do, really. I think he nailed the sort of nervous desk man, I think. That's what I felt. Like he's been
very fair.
thrust into this espionage spy role that he's not up to it. So, like, it's clearly not up to it, but I think that's probably what they were going for. So I think maybe we should just delve into the actual, what the plot is. It is centers around the Munich Agreement, where, like Neville Chamberlain and the British government and the French government, the Italians are all trying to hash out this agreement to sort out the Sudetenland, sorry. It's all up in the air, what's going to happen. And there's this document that von Hartmann comes into possession of, which is it the case green?
It's the Hossbach memo.
It's the minutes from a meeting on November 5th, 1937, where Hitler kind of outlines to the military leaders his general future plans for future conquest.
Right. Yeah. So this is a really important document. It blow the whole, the whole diplomacy element of it out of the water. Is going to change. It would change everything. And MacKay, Legate, is called upon by MI5 to travel with Chamberlain to the meeting and show Chamberlain the document and potentially change the course of history. And that's the meat of the plot, really. There's nothing else really going on apart from this. Will MacKay get the document to Chamberlain? In the end, he does, and it doesn't really matter. it's a bit of a shame.
What I thought was unusual was that Chamberlain hadn't been briefed to expect to see any documents or anything like that, and no one within his staff had been briefed on this. So Chamberlain was being shown this document on the grounds of it being it's important, and the only person explaining it to him was a relatively junior official. None of his group of advisors and ministers that traveled with him to Munich were the ones saying, we have intelligence from a German diplomat who opposes Hitler and wants to present this to you. It may help us in the negotiations. That's what I was expecting, because I knew the basics plot that, there was these two friends that were diplomats and they had to get an important document to one another, and that would help shape the situation. But that doesn't happen.
That would have made it more of like a sort of a thrillery type where, if Chamberlain had like an outline of what this document could contain, and he's got to try and stall the talks to buy MacKay more time to go and get the document and bring it back, and he's being chased by the guy, that SS officer that was von Hartmann's mate. I thought that was what we were going to get. But in the end, we get this sort of 3-minute meeting where Neville Chamberlain goes,
we're doing that thing where we write better films.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we always do.
I also, like, you would expect that somebody would be like, hey, Neville, at some point, Hugh may say something. You should listen to Hugh. He may have information you need.
Yeah, even if it was just as subtle as that would have helped Hugh, wouldn't it?
It really would have.
Why wouldn't MI5 just go, yo, Nev, there's this document in Germany. We're going to send a chap to go get it. Can you stall Hitler for 5 minutes?
And then they send a young typist as his backup and don't tell him that she's going to...
Exactly,
That was a very odd turn of events. Like, once she was introduced, this is Angie Mahindra, who plays Joan. She's a member of the, I think it's Downing Street typing pool.
Mm-hmm.
She's taken along as a secretary to type up notes and the agreements, etc., etc. And that all seems fairly normal. And it kind of evolves that she's keeping an eye on Legate. And there's a scene in the film where Legate has gotten the document. Great. He's preparing to show Hitler. He's preparing to show Chamberlain.
Don't show Hitler, cry.
That would have been a very different film. But,
Mr. Adolf, I think you dropped something.
Indiana Jones just pops up with a diary and he's like, there's this document in this book. Do you want to sign this one? Anyway, so he's shown Chamberlain, and then he's preparing to get it out of the country back to Britain to hopefully show it to someone who can be influential and help it change British the approach to Germany. And it's missing, and he has a little confrontation with the SS officer, or the Leibstandarte member who's in charge of Hitler's general security, I think he explains. And later, at the very end of the film, we find out that she took it, not the German officer. So they do have that document. And I just didn't know where that was going or why that was done.
Oh, no,
because
I was like, hang on then.
I thought the adaptation of the book was going to round it out so that none of that subplot actually had any impact at all. So the meeting didn't have any impact, and what is hinted to be the Hosbach memo doesn't play any role at all either, because it was lost in Munich and it never got back to Britain. But then it's revealed that he has the memo still, and that they can take it back to London and hopefully show it to people and have an impact. But why was that something that needed to pay off like that? I just didn't see how that added to the narrative of the film.
It seemed odd, like it's basically the entire reason that the typist character exists. And so it's weird, like, because it's not just like a one-time thing that happens at the end. Like, it requires like multiple scenes of setup for this character who exists just to take an envelope off screen and to deliver it to our main character in a car.
Yeah,
pretty much. That's it. And that's what confused me. I was just thinking, is there supposed to be more to that character? But with a runtime as long as this, I don't think they cut anything from that was going to be added later.
I wonder if in the book, like, does that character play a larger role of some kind in the book, where you get a bit more space?
Probably. I'll talk about this later with the runtime, but there is room to fit her in and give her way more to do. There's whole conference rooms full of room for this movie to do more, and it just at the start, I think I'll say it now, it takes 40 minutes to get to our actual plot, and by that time I know a couple of people who actually fell asleep because nothing was happening, ironically, thinking what MacKay says at the start. But it's like, I don't know, I just don't enjoy movies that do that. Go, well, here's what you think the plot is. It's going to be about Neville Chamberlain going to Munich and doing these, you're going to get like a political thriller.
Europe's greatest what if,
Exactly, that's what I thought we were getting. And then it goes, Leg, this man's from MI5. He's got something that we'd like you to do for us. And it's like, what? Now it's a spy film. Like, it was sort of a bit like, I'd rather have that at the start. Could we not have just set up MacKay as like this normal desk jockey bloke? He works with Neville Chamberlain, and 10 minutes in, you're a spy now. Wow, okay, that's cool. But because it took so long to get into it, I was just sort of floundering at this point. I was like, okay, he's got to go and get this document now.
We have to spend a lot of time learning about how Hugh has a really poor work-life balance, and it's affecting his personal life.
Yeah,
it's very true.
Very true.
And all of the scenes with his wife and his family, I don't really think they really add anything. We could get an idea of his character from, this is like the most busy time the Foreign Office and Downing Street, Westminster must have been having,
because
throughout that period.
Everyone else looks like they're really flustered, like the guy he works with, but he's not. He's just having lunch at the Ritz or wherever it was. And
It'd be completely forgiven for him not to have scenes with family members, and that would free up space for other stories. He could have been talking to colleagues with a bit more setup.
Talking to the typist?
Exactly. Yeah. Or set him up to be a bit like sort of overly flustered. He's saying like, all my job is taking the documents from room to room, and make his job that he does reinvigorate him to think it's interesting. Or you say, he could have said, I'm just a paper pusher. Later on, the MI5 goes, well, you can push papers for the government, for Queen and Country now. You could have something like that. Just set the guy up to be a little bit more than this sort of, I don't know, just this sort of nobody character. But maybe that's what the character in the book is meant to be. But I just wanted more from his character, because you're wasting George MacKay. That's the only issue for me.
I think the problem is that we spend all this time learning about the poor work-life balance, the family problems, et cetera, for Hugh. And then we end the movie with him obviously wanting to reconnect in a more meaningful way with his wife based on what he's experienced in Munich. But the decision he makes is that, oh, I should join the military because that fixes, work-life balance problems very quickly and is known for helping people connect with their spouses.
Yeah, I think his wife's reaction to that was probably everyone's reaction to that, where she was just dumbfounded. She didn't have a lot to say on that, did she?
No. I'll join
She
the
was
RAF.
just kind of like,
right, then.
what?
All right, fine. It's like,
it was just a bit odd,
Mm.
Him ordering half a bottle of Chablis was the end of that for the hair, wasn't it? She was just, no, that's the last straw.
She'll love rationing in about a year.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Al Murray, and you're listening to Fighting on Film, the world's #1 war film podcast.
When we know that these political thrillers from the period like Darkest Hour can really work well to impart the gravitas and the severity and the importance of all those historic moments, which don't necessarily involve explosions and gunfire and actual battles and fighting. It's what was happening on the political scene. It can be done really well, and I was hoping for perhaps just a little bit more of that in the actual Munich Agreement.
I thought we were going to get something like The Gathering Storm, where you saw I know it isn't what the book is about, but on some level the book is about the Munich Agreement, surely. So we could have just had a bit. I felt myself wanting to see more of Jeremy Irons being Neville Chamberlain, because I was absolutely astounded at how much he looked like him. I could forgive the voice; it's fine. I think he got the sort of nuances of his movement, and he was playing him like an older man. It was really nice. Especially the scenes where he leaves, and they've recreated those scenes of him leaving for the talks verbatim. Really nice. Really appreciate that.
The scenes by the aircraft.
Yeah, because I went back and compared the scenes with the original newsreel, and it's pretty bang on.
Very good. It's very good.
Even down to people cheering him and stuff like that. Really nice. Because I think as well, I know I was going to ask everybody this. I wonder I don't know what your views on Chamberlain are, everyone, but it seemed pretty revisionist. I know he in the last few years, Chamberlain's got a lot of flack for walking us into a world war, for being a sort of king of appeasement, shall we say. But I think the movie sort of portrayed him in a more like a fairer way. It didn't portray him as like this sort of bumbling fool from the Victorian age that he's sort of presented as now. What do you think?
Wesley, do you want to go first?
How long do you have? How long do you have? Okay.
Oh God, I've opened.
This is like, so a lot of in my kind of social circle online, this is a lot of what is being discussed around this movie is its portrayal of Chamberlain. I think the typical portrayal of Chamberlain during this period is one of an extreme, bordering on bumbling sort of optimist, where he doesn't fully understand that what he's doing is going to have negative consequences. And he doesn't understand that what he's like, the peace he's trying to make is not possible. I think the film does a better job of, whether or not you agree with it as truth or not, it does a good job of showing Chamberlain as it makes it very clear that what they're trying to show is that Chamberlain is a politician put in a bad situation, and he's trying to make the best of it, right? Where he doesn't believe that Britain is ready for war, so he's trying to push it off into the future. He, is trying to get Hitler to sign that peace note on the day after the conference because he hopes that it will build sort of political capital against Germany in the future. Now, none of this ends up happening, but I think that's what they're trying to portray. My view of Chamberlain is maybe slightly more negative than that, although not as negative as some people. I think some people, you will get reactions or online, or you will hear information online about the Munich Agreement caused the Second World War to happen because of XYZ, which I think is far too negative about the appeasement effort in general. But I think that the film probably is a far swerve away from typical sort of popular histories of this time period that view appeasement incredibly negatively, where here it's kind of in a spot where it's a necessary
means to buying time is what they're trying to suggest with the film, isn't it?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Which is one of the revisionist points of view. And the thing with Chamberlain's legacy is that as soon as he was forced to step down in 1940, that legacy has been shaped and reshaped and reshaped by not only his political rivals at the time, but also people that followed him. And then the revisionist movement came in the late 60s, I think. And we've seen it turn on its head again to it was appeasement. It was a bad idea. It should never have been attempted, to perhaps a more, with representing with Harris's his fiction and this film, it's presenting a more revisionist, once again, aspect. And I was quite surprised. I didn't think the film was as revisionist as it was going to be, until we have that nice little scene at the end where they're on board the aircraft, which was a Lockheed 14 Super Electra, by the way. That's the alley tally for this week, guys.
Lovely.
And the end notes at the end of the film, where it says the Munich Agreement bought time for Britain to rearm, and that was the most stark presentation of this revisionist idea, that what Chamberlain was doing was, I'm buying time for Britain to rearm, to defend itself, not necessarily to defeat Germany, because that would have taken a lot more money and a lot more time.
Because no one ever directly says in the movie, do they, that we need to stop Hitler because we don't have an army capable of fighting him off yet. No one's that blunt, which was good. I'm glad they didn't go there.
Yeah, I was surprised they didn't. I had an almost semi-expectation that it would be much more overtly revisionist than it was. But it was more of a presentation of Chamberlain as being, whether this is true of his actual character, of because people's appraisals even now of his character span such a vast array, from like being, he was appallingly self-centered to he was the time-honored statesman.
He's like Marmite, isn't he? He's political Marmite. You love him or you hate him.
Yeah, he's political Marmite for the late 20th century, mid 20th century. But the thing is, I was really interested that scene in the garden he has with Leggett and his wife, where he explains his motivations for wanting to make a peace with Hitler, in that he didn't fight in the First World War, and he saw people go off to fight this horrible war.
Yeah.
And he's vowed to himself forever that this would be, he would work as hard as he possibly could to avoid anything like that from ever happening again. So whether that was a true representation, I don't know. But
yeah, great dialogue though. I really like that speech. Whether he said it or not, probably didn't. But like it set him up as an appeaser, and I could side with that view. I think anyone could side with that view. Would you rather strive hard to, appease a tyrant and not have a war than have a war that is going to be worse than the First World War, just because of all the technological advances and whatever? I don't know if Chamberlain was even aware of any of that, but at least it was nice to sort of try and explain appeasement in a nutshell really quickly to people.
Well, we have this view of appeasement with 100% 2020 hindsight, don't we?
Yeah, of course.
So we know that it didn't work, and we know that the horrible war that they hoped to avoid happened anyway. Yeah. So this is something I was going to come on to a little bit later as well, which was, when watching this film, we have this benefit of hindsight, and we can watch this and know what's going to happen. Everyone in that moment in the film and in reality didn't have that benefit. So you can understand the political desire to appease. But I just thought it was really interesting that they added that layer of him wanting to avoid this war because he saw so many go off to fight the last one.
Yeah.
I think one of the challenges this movie has, and I don't think it sticks the landing on solving this problem, is that it has a fictional plot with a bunch of characters we have to get to know. They have to have arcs, they have to have stories. And then it has a semi-factual, I'll say, I won't go straight to say it's 100% factual along the historic path. Yeah. But it is mostly on rails, and it feels like there's not enough, it doesn't spend enough time discussing those events, right? It doesn't talk about some pieces that I think would really help. If the story is around Neville Chamberlain and appeasement, if you want to tell that story, then maybe you do have a scene at the beginning with the British military where they talk about the relative preparedness between the two militaries in 1938. maybe you have something about the fact that by the time they go to Munich, Chamberlain has already met personally with Hitler twice and had these same conversations and had a back and
mention
forth.
of that, is there?
And there's nothing about any of that. And I think that kind of does. I think it still
there's
works.
That little scene where they're walking up the steps into the conference building and they exchange a glance to one another, and it almost feels like that's the first time that they've ever met, which
absolutely
isn't the case at all.
True. Yeah. It's like the movie dangles these little carrots out in front of you as if it's like, for people that know, as if to go, oh, look, you know what happens here. Look at this shiny bit of history. Lovely. Oh, now back to our espionage plot. You're like, but hang on, I want to see Irons and Hitler and Mussolini. I want to see Chamberlain and all them lot actually do something, because it would only add to the tension if we saw what the actual guys were going through, trying to hash out.
Oh God, Mussolini didn't even appear.
Yeah, he looked good though. The guy who played him.
You literally see the back of his head, and that's it, don't you?
I know. Is he in the car with Hitler?
He is. That's it. You see the back of his head or the side of his head. He doesn't say anything. There's no impact really. He's spoken about in third person. That's it.
Weird, yeah. And
same with the French.
Yeah, exactly. Because at the start, when you see Chamberlain's in his his office, and he's got the chief of staff there, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army. It's like you said, Wesley. It's like you've missed that meeting of, how many tanks we got, how many ships have we got ready to sail. It's sort of. I kind of wish we'd seen that a little bit. So at least we, as the audience, because obviously we've got to remember, not everyone, as we've said, not everyone watching this movie is going to know 100% of the facts. And because the movie doesn't even say at any point that it is a fiction, annoyed me until the end. Because if like most people, you turn it off the minute it stops, then you think that movie's true. And this is, I always say every week, and I'll say it again until the listeners hate it. These movies have to tell you this, because it's really important, because now people are going to leave the cinema or leave their TVs at home thinking, one, there was a man in a room that could have shot Hitler, and two, that no one was preparing to fight Hitler either. So it's like, it just feels like there's scenes in the movie that we could have just had added on to just show the historical context a little bit, to then show MacKay and the made up story, to show how the impact that could have had or could have on proceedings. I think that's my overarching feeling.
One other piece I'd like to add there is that, now I may be mistaken, maybe I missed it, but I don't think there's ever a conversation that gives the geography of the area that they are like talking about at Munich. And I feel like that's another thing, because a critical part of what Chamberlain says along the way and why he's justifying what he's doing is around public sentiment, around not wanting to, I don't remember the exact words, but basically not wanting to fight about some small bit of territory in Eastern Europe, which is territory that we've never established what it is or where it is.
He said something like, oh, the British public don't care about some border conflict. I'm like, yes. Okay, you mean the Sudetenland, that a big bit of, a big piece of land. It's not a, it's just a little bit, so it's not enough. Like you owe it to the history to say it's not going to harm.
Well, they could have just panned over a map of Europe, couldn't they? During that as those Joint Chiefs are leaving, the Imperial staff is leaving, they could have just panned across a map showing the state land and where they expect the Germans to be, etc. But they don't get that, and the only mention of the Czechs we get at the actual conference is, the Czechs aren't here, of course. That was a big thing. That was a big crux.
Sorry, it could have done what Forgotten Battle did and had a map at the start. Like it's so simple, it's so cliche, but it would have helped.
I'm reminded, like, I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan. Just out there in movie going, watching land out there for everybody listening. I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan. Classic. There's a specific scene in Lord of the Rings where it is literally just a guy pointing at a map where they talk about things happening on the map. And that's what this movie needs. It's like, it needs a map that somebody's voicing over or pointing at or something. Circling back, not to extend that one too much longer, the Czech stuff. So small little complaint here around the Czechs. Like they're mentioned several times, like, hey, why aren't they here? Well, they're not here, blah, 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 blah. But fun fact, there were actually two Czechoslovakian representatives in Munich at the time, and the British and French would actually deliver the agreement to them sort of before it was signed, so that they could communicate it back to Prague, their government. So I don't know. That's small, but I know it's
nice to see that. Yeah, exactly. They get sort of written out their own history a little bit, just a bit upsetting.
which is a problem with history of the Munich Agreement. As a person who read a lot of books by British authors about this agreement, it's amazing how little is said about Czechoslovakia, is all I will say.
Hello there, sorry to interrupt. I wanted to let you know that you can now join our supporting cast over on Patreon. As thanks for your support, you'll be able to help us pick films, submit questions for guests, have first pick on brand new and exclusive merch, and much more. Thank you for your support. Now back to the show.
So, obviously, we were delving into the historical context there a little bit, but as we have you with us, Wesley, you've done your 9-part series on the Munich Agreements. If you haven't listened to that, listeners, please go away and find it. Wesley's podcast is fantastic. It's just Wesley telling you the facts. It's fantastic. So, linking it back to this movie, Wesley. So, what does the movie actually get right for historical context terms?
Absolutely. So there are a lot of like small things that I really like about the movie. Now, these are all small moments. They're not huge sort of storylines. I'm just going to start sort of going through them. So one of the ones is around how Hitler hated details in these meetings. So in one of the scenes, the translator Schmidt comes back down into kind of the meeting room where all of the non-top level functionaries are kind of just hanging out waiting for the meetings to end, and he says that they're like hung up in details, and this is like well documented that Hitler hated details so much, and Chamberlain constantly wanted to talk about them. So one of the big stories of the earlier meetings between Chamberlain and Hitler, and then also the one at Munich, is that Chamberlain constantly wanted to discuss details like, how would the government of Czechoslovakia and the citizens of the Sudetenland that wanted to leave be compensated for their property, and how would like movable property be handled, like livestock, like what are you going to do with all these cows, who gets the cows, are the kinds of details that he would bring up during these meetings. And apparently it just drove Hitler crazy. So I was really glad that little bit came into the movie.
I've got like visions now of like Neville with his sort of clipped sort of accent going, what about the cows, Adolf? Please, it's very important to me that you tell me what's going to happen to the livestock. It's brilliant. That's great.
Another really good one was, one of the critical scenes of the movie is when Hugh gets to accompany Chamberlain to his morning meeting with Hitler after the Munich Agreement is signed. They sign like the lasting peace note, and the reason that Hugh gets to come along is because he claims that Chamberlain needs a translator. And this is really interesting because what actually happened at the first meeting between Chamberlain and Hitler in Munich several weeks prior is that it was only Schmidt, Hitler, and Chamberlain that were in the room. Like those were the only 3 people. And Chamberlain was never provided any minutes from that meeting, so he had to write all of it down from memory later. And I think the line in the movie is that like we can't trust Schmidt to translate or to sort of keep a good record of what's happening. Okay, now those were incredibly nitpicky. One other small little nitpick is when Hugh delivers the note to Chamberlain in the House of Commons when he's making a speech. In real history, they don't actually interrupt Chamberlain. The person sitting behind him actually waits for a break, and there's some applause, and then he hands him the note, and then he says stuff. Right. That is like tiny details. But one more.
You got to have George MacKay running. It's in his contract.
Exactly.
It
like
be.
It's
yeah.
And that's one of those like movie changes that is totally obvious on why they did it. Like you don't have the all important note sitting in the background for a minute while he gives a speech before it's passed over. Okay, and then another one that I thought was interesting, and it really stood out to me specifically because of what I've been thinking a lot about recently with the podcast, is I would bet a lot of money that the person who wrote the book read Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by Schreier. It's obviously a very well-known source, very sort of, I would call it pivotal source in sort of the rise of the Nazis in 1930s Germany. However, what triggered this in me was during the scene where the three friends are meeting in Munich in 1932, kind of the pivotal scene where Hugh and Paul kind of have their falling out because Paul has really bought into the Naziness and Lena very much has not. She's very much resisting that. And Hugh also, as a good British boy, is not a fan of that fanaticism. They use the word fanatic a lot in that scene.
Yeah.
But one of the specific lines that Lena says is that she talks about the Nazis' violence and then also calls them perverts, which I think is a really weird word to use in that scene because they're talking about violence. Like the entire scene is about how they're violent and they're hurting people and they're, taking over by force. And but the word pervert is actually from Schreier. Schreier uses it a lot to describe the homosexuality present in the SA at this point in time. Schreier is quite the homophobe, which was, quite widespread at the time in some countries. And so he uses the word pervert often to describe them. And I found it really interesting that made it into the script at a time that you would never use that word. It's not something that anybody is discussing in that scene, but they still threw it in there, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, I didn't pick up on that. When she said it, I sort of like, okay, perfect. Yeah, okay, I can stretch that. I can buy that. But now you've said it.
Yeah, I suppose I assumed she was speaking perhaps about the perversion of power or that sort of thing. And that's interesting.
It's possible. It's possible that I'm reading that totally wrong. No,
but that's interesting. It's always interesting to understand the historiography behind where people are basing their appraisal of the situation that they're going to put forth.
That was good. I like that. That's some super sleuthing. I love it.
And then I also liked, I think I mentioned earlier that like Paul is my favorite character in this movie. I like his arc, his character development. Yeah. And I think it's interesting as a kind of a single person study of some of the evolution of thought on Hitler politically during this period. So if you look at 1932, before Hitler takes power, and how people view all of the radical stuff that Hitler is saying about his future plans, a lot of people write it off. They're just like, oh yeah, he's saying those things. He's super anti-Semitic. But once he becomes sort of a government leader, once he comes into power, that will mellow out. And, he won't be he won't be putting those policies into place. Those are just to, get his stormtroopers riled up and get his supporters riled up in these speeches. And so Paul seems to think that as well. Like a lot of what Paul says in 1932 is that he wants, Hitler to be in power because he's talking about making Germany, what it used to be, where it was a real power in Europe and where it was really an impactful player in global events. And he discounts all of these, violent things that Hitler says he's going to do in the same way that, Nazi politicians or German politicians and international political leaders were all discounting some of the more radical stuff that he was saying.
Yeah, that part where they're discussing it after visiting Lena in a catatonic state, and he talks about I thought they would move away from that when they became the government. I think you're spot on there. I thought that scene is a lot of exposition about Paul's own turnaround and where he was coming from, where he is now. And I agree. I think he's probably the most interesting character that has the most development that you see throughout the film.
Because he's not, as I said earlier, he feels like he's lost so much that his only emotion is to get revenge on the Nazi party, whether it be fighting them directly or shooting Hitler, it was stopping them. It feels like he will go to the lengths that no one is prepared to go to stop war. He's like the sort of, he's the anti-appeaser if Neville Chamberlain is the pro appeaser at the end. So I like the parallel. But I just wish sort of MacKay had the same drive that he had, because he didn't really have much. He didn't have a hat in the ring, really. Your friend, one of your best friends from your school days has died, and he just seems like a bit bored of it. He's like, oh, okay, oh, that's a shame,
His upper lip was just a little too stiff.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, yeah.
I would have enjoyed this movie better. This may be getting into final thoughts territory as well.
That's fine.
if Hugh and Paul's positions were reversed in terms of how they were treated by the movie. I think if Paul was treated as more of a main character and a lot of that early movie was spent with Paul instead of with Hugh, I think it is a more interesting movie, just because Paul has more interesting things to do and more interesting development throughout the film.
Definitely.
We get a little bit of that where he's meeting with members of the army and other foreign diplomat corps colleagues, and they're kind of almost a proto-resistance, and they're discussing what they're going to do and how they'll do it. And there's that really interesting bit where they're like, Hitler needs to make this move so we can trigger opposition within the army.
And that's absolutely like historically accurate. So what is happening there is there's a coup that would theoretically have been led by Chief of Staff General Halder at this point in time. And so there were two things that they thought were essential for the coup to succeed. The first was that Hitler declare war to start it off, so that they could in some way like charge him with some sort of crime of taking Germany to war. Right. I'm being very wishy-washy here because of my thoughts on the likelihood of such a thing succeeding. But then also they needed Hitler to be in Berlin because of the specific military leaders that were sort of in on the plot. So like they had, the commander of the sort of Berlin garrison and the commander of such. There was a commander of the Potsdam garrison that they also sort of had in on the plot. And then there was a specific division of troops between Munich and Berlin that could act as a blocking force that they needed it. Like the last place you want Hitler to launch it, if you're going to launch a coup against Hitler, the very last place in Germany you want him to be is in Munich.
Okay. Yeah. It's all a little bit Valkyrie, isn't it? Trying to get in the right places and all things like that.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. Why were they held in Munich in the first place, Wesley?
The talks were held in Munich. That's actually a really good question. I'm not sure where the specifics of, hey, we should do this in Munich came from. I don't think I've ever read anything about somebody like.
Neither have I. That's why I was wondering. It just came to me just then. I was, well, obviously Hitler wasn't located in Munich at that time. Why are they meeting in Munich? I suppose it's slightly closer geographically.
It is roughly middle between all the four parties. Like it's sort of in that region of middle. I don't know the answer to that. If any listeners know, at me on Twitter with that information, please.
Sorry, it's maybe because they wanted to go to the beer hall because Nev wanted the bev. Terrible.
And on that note, what were your favorite scenes from the film?
So kind of thinking about ones that we haven't talked about so far, like stuff like the final scene between Paul and Hitler, or the sort of the climactic scene with Chamberlain, Paul, and Hugh. I enjoyed the scene where Paul is on a train he's moving from Berlin to Munich with the entire like entourage of the German government. And he's like having to hide the papers on the train behind a mirror, also hide the gun that he has. And so I thought that was just interesting tension. Like that train scene, I thought was interesting tension.
Yeah, it was good. I wanted more of that. Like,
I thought that pistol definitely would have wobbled out from underneath that wash basin.
That's exactly what I was thinking the whole time. I was like, first of all, that like trains jiggle, like they're not perfectly sort of steady. So like, that envelope's going to shift just enough to drop behind that mirror, or the gun's going to fall off.
What if it dropped just enough so it was in the center of the mirror and he'd never been able to get it out again?
Yeah.
Roll
Show
credits.
me that movie.
Yeah. I wanted a really convoluted subplot of Neville's Chamberlain staff going to that butcher shop to get some meat after they complained about getting all the vegetarian food. Is that I really like that.
That was a really interesting inclusion. I wondered, is that historically accurate? Because that's a very specific thing to include.
Yeah, so the Hitler vegetarian stuff, absolutely. Now I would need to look at the menu for what it was in history, but I would be shocked if they would have a major sort of feast or whatever it's called, a major meal at one of these things, and only have vegetarian options. That seems very odd.
I mean, maybe it's a power play from Hitler, perhaps.
Yeah, perhaps so.
But I thought it was a funny inclusion. Like there is there's some decent humor in the script, but it was just interesting.
It's well written. It's certainly in the dialogue. It's well written. Although one of the British typists is heard going, if you could get some towels delivered to the room, that would be amazing. Which amazing wasn't a piece of vernacular that was really used in that sort of context. I thought that was a bit jarring. I was like, oh, okay. But yeah, that is nitpicking.
Yeah. Yeah.
But Rob, I mean, was that your favorite scene? What was your favorite?
No, my favorite scene. I just thought that was a funny line. My favorite scenes are, as I said earlier, Chamberlain getting on the planes to leave because they chose to do it verbatim. And I really enjoyed that. I mean, I don't think there's any other way you could have done those scenes because they're so iconic. You know, we've all seen the picture of Neville with his bit of paper flapping in the wind, which I think that's quite a cool allegory for what happened. But it annoys me as well.
It's a much better allegory than the storm clouds.
Exactly. I'm just going to get onto that. So
they really laid those on heavy.
They really did lay them on thick, didn't they? So obviously he leaves, and that's all fine. They don't really milk that bit of him leaving. And then when he comes back, you get Chamberlain starts his speech of saying how he's met with Hitler and it's all gone well, and then they pan upwards and you see some clouds and it's like the storm of war is upon us. It's all very sort of beat you over the head sort of thing. But I wanted so much more from that scene. One, didn't want them to pan away from Chamberlain saying his speech, because I felt him saying it all would have added weight.
It would have been great if it transitioned to him in the House of Commons giving his peace in our time speech.
That would have been nice. But then I felt there was a missed opportunity from the film where you could have had his words over a montage of, say, Wehrmacht troops mobilizing, or Hitler having interspersed Hitler laughing about the agreement, saying, "Oh, I've sold them up the river. I'm actually going to do this." You could have shown the actual, how Hitler was duplicitous and how, Chamberlain had been made a fool of. You could have showed that as well. I think they just missed an opportunity there to show us MacKay deciding he wants to join the RAF. Like, it sort of, there was just a missed opportunity. But I love the scenes where they recreated the newsreel footage, because I just wanted to see Irons be Chamberlain more. Like, that's my takeaway.
Yeah. For me, I would agree there, Rob. I think there's some of my favorites in the film as well. I enjoyed it cinematically, the way that they recreated and reposed those shots, because there's some brilliant newsreel footage of that survives, and you can go and watch that and you can see that Irons has clearly studied his mannerisms and the way he moves his arm. And even down to, there's a little bit of newsreel of where he's about to leave for Munich, and he quotes, "My father always said, if you don't, at first you don't succeed, try again, and I'm going to go and try again." And that is possibly, to our 21st century ears, is probably quite a clunky political statement nowadays.
Yeah.
But it's also telling of Chamberlain's, character and what he was hoping to achieve. So I really love those shots, and I love the plane shots. The really Super nice. Electra, gorgeous plane, polished metal bodywork, just looks. Those planes of the 30s.
Price target for an anti-aircraft gun.
Well, you shouldn't shoot down diplomatic planes, Rob. That's not fair. That's not done. But yes,
you should shoot Hitler, but he didn't.
Yes, I know. That would have been a what if film, wouldn't it? Yeah. The scenes with Irons were the standouts, weren't they? I thought he looked so spot on. I mean, when you compare it to previous depictions, so we had Roger Parrott in The King's Speech, we had Ronald Pickup in Darkest Hour, and we had Jack Shepherd in Into the Storm, and they're all varying amounts of depiction on screen, granted, but none of them looked quite as close to Chamberlain as Irons. Although Irons is possibly a little bit more grizzled than Chamberlain, and obviously, as we've said, his voice is a little deeper and a little bit more gruff than the relatively soft-spoken Chamberlain.
But you could sell him. You could sell a Chamberlain biopic with Irons now. I think that's
absolutely
clear.
Yeah. I would watch it if it was Irons in the title role and it was Darkest Hour-esque approach to
Appeasement, the
going from
musical.
37 to 1940. That would be a great film.
Yeah,
like,
that'd be brilliant.
Up until Norway, that would be really interesting.
That would be great. Yeah, maybe we can have that now. We can show Chamberlain in the war, because I don't think that ever gets really explored.
No. Well, people don't realize that he was the prime minister for
Yeah, they tend to
6
think
months
that
after that
Churchill just
into the war.
appears where war's declared, but no, it was one and a bit years where he wasn't in charge. It's like.
And I think there's an interesting story there, because you're basically watching a man who saw everything he was pushing for years just like fall apart into a catastrophic war that does not go well for his country.
No.
While he's in charge.
Mm.
In 1940, I found a little bit he'd written in a letter to one of his friends before he died. And he says, "So far as my personal reputation is concerned, I'm not in the least disturbed about it. The letters which I am still receiving in such vast quantities so unanimously dwell on the same point. Namely, without Munich, the war would have been lost and the empire destroyed in 1938. I think Harris has probably pulled a great deal from that sentiment there, in that it appears that Chamberlain felt that buying that time in 38 was very pivotal to how things developed afterwards.
And he was also dying of cancer, so probably quite reflective time of his life, you'd think, as well.
I think that, and I think that's part of the reason that we kind of opened some of this discussion with the discussion of how Chamberlain is portrayed, and why I think it's going to be very divisive. Like I was reading comments on your Twitter account after you said you were going to review this movie, over the weekend as people were watching it, and there were several people that were displeased with kind of the favorable light that Chamberlain is put on in this movie. And I think that a lot of it does come back to the idea of like, we know how this story ends. Like we know the fourth act of this film and what happens with all these decisions that are made. And so it's hard to properly judge how people viewed the situation at the time and why they made the decisions that they made.
Yeah, definitely. It's it is interesting in that regard. I think Chamberlain will continue to be one of those divisive figures. I don't think we're ever going to pin what we really think of him. It's not solid as Churchill as this sort of war-winning underdog coming up from the ranks, becoming this war-winning hero. Chamberlain's always sort of, that's the man that caused the war. We don't talk about him. It's sort of, it will divide opinion, but depictions like this will help perhaps people go away and learn more about the man, and
hopefully go and appraise him themselves, because it's widely forgotten that he was in government after he resigned and left office, and kind of lost in the whole revisionist debate around appeasement and that aspect of his premiership.
Talking about appeasement, chaps, we're coming into final thoughts. Did the movie appease you, or did it appall you?
Ooh, that was a fantastic segue.
Wow.
I'd written that down. I wrote that down.
Yeah,
earlier.
I know. I
That's
saw you
broken my mind.
Wesley, you're the guest. Please go first.
I think overall, with all the problems, around pacing and length and some of the characters, I enjoyed my time watching the movie. I think that was almost certainly colored to a large extent by my knowledge of all the history that's happening around this, that the movie is largely not interested in showing you. You're kind of on the historical sort of railroad in that regard. But I did think it was interesting. And I think that, I generally had fun watching the movie, even if at points it drug a little bit and didn't have kind of the tension I was hoping. And it was helped by what I thought was a great portrayal by Irons, for sure. Love Jeremy Irons. And so I would cautiously recommend it to people, as long as they don't go in with too high of expectations.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I enjoyed it. It's a competently made film. The camera work's really nice. The
Mhm.
editing's quite well done. Everything in it is competent for a movie. There's nothing that's lacking. But I just think the story itself could have had more tension, as you say. It could have had a bit more punch to it. Could have been trimmed down a little bit. I felt 2.5 hours was just a little bit too long for me. I found myself getting a little bit bored at the start and towards the end, because I was like, right, come on, we know what happens. And I think maybe because I don't fully want to recommend it. I'd recommend if you know nothing about the Munich Agreement, this is a good starting point, but it's definitely not something to sort of, if you're looking for 100%
Don't frame this as
accuracy.
your understanding.
Yeah,
Mhm.
don't base
Yeah.
a thesis on this. We probably could, but it's sort of like, yeah. So I just think we don't rate movies, but it's just a 7 out of 10. If it had more historical bits in it, if it had a little bit more, maybe Chamberlain and Hitler talking, maybe if you saw a little bit more about the movie's called Munich, but you see fuck all
The
in it. It's like,
the
come on.
entirety of the Munich Agreement. I'm sorry, this is final thoughts,
No,
but the
please.
entirety of the Munich Agreement happens off screen,
Yeah.
right? They disappear upstairs, and suddenly they have an agreement, and they come downstairs to sign it.
Yeah, it's so true. Exactly. The movie's called Edge of War, but I wish it had put me on the edge of my seat in it, and it didn't.
For me, I think cinematically it's competent, well made. And as we've said about other films before, that almost adds to I wish that skill had been put to better use, in that we'd had a little bit more of a darkest hour approach, where we get a look at more of the actual politics and the diplomacy that was going on. The mise en scène of the film felt really good. I liked it. I thought that was a very, very strong aspect of the film.
Yeah.
Some lovely old Mercedes, probably the wrong year, but who knows? Not a car expert.
It's just very believable timepiece, isn't it? It's all very.
You sit there and you think, oh, that looks like 1930s Britain. That looks like 1930s Munich. It's what you have in your mind. Some of the aspects didn't work for me. While I loved the fact that it was an Anglo-German cast and it drew on strengths from both, some of the supporting characters were underused a little bit, I thought. Some of the scenes just did not work. I thought their meeting in the same jazz pub that they'd been to in 1932 seemed unlikely. That German jazz club probably wouldn't be as busy as it was now, because jazz was frowned upon in Nazi Germany. They definitely wouldn't have sat down next to an SS officer and had that conversation in German.
Yeah, I didn't even think
about and the fact that Paul even goes, Leggett, you would make a terrible spy, because he just sort of like takes the paper from him and looks at it. That scene is, someone should have looked at that and gone, this doesn't quite work. It doesn't look right. If we could, that whole scene could have contained an awful lot more tension. If it had been done elsewhere and in a different way. I just didn't. I thought that was a low point in the film in terms of attention to detail in the way they were trying to present it.
I'm sure there's bits in the book that make sense. They just
I'm sure there are.
Film. It's probably annoying.
Yeah, I agree. As a piece of cinema, I enjoyed it. And Wesley's skillfully laid out all of the little elements that he's picked out there, and I agree with him completely. That can't really be seen as a representation of the Munich agreements, and I agree with you as well, Rob, that it can't be seen as something you can base your understanding of Munich on.
Yeah, because obviously, that's the problem, because it never says at any point, apart from very at the end, it goes, this was fiction.
Yeah,
because it's presenting itself as fact in places. I think that's what detracts a lot from the movie for me, just because of what this could potentially do to the, hive mind sort of way we sometimes think about events. Yeah, the understanding of it going forward, perhaps.
I think the fact that they give you so much of that side plot, or the main plot, basically, away from the agreement being signed behind doors, is used to take away from showing you that. They make a conscious decision in both a narrative sense and a cinematic sense that this film about Munich is not going to be about Munich. It is going to be about this tale of two friends and the espionage that they're attempting to do. And I thought some of the choices around that I mentioned earlier with the document reappearing at the end. I thought that didn't quite make sense in terms of a narrative for the film. So there's little bits that kind of fall down, as well as some of the more larger narrative choices of, I wish I'd seen more of the Munich Agreement. But I mean, it's not a film about the Munich Agreement. It was perhaps sold as that in the trailer, but really, I suppose it's more of a fiction piece set to the backdrop of it. And if you go into the film with a knowledge of Munich and expecting a espionage film set against the backdrop of that, then it certainly works.
Of course, it's not as explosive and as alley-tally fest that we usually do. We can do highbrow, as you've seen. So, Wesley, we want to thank you a lot for coming on. If just give people a little bit of background in what you do, where they should find you, how can they listen to your podcast? Because me and Matt listened to your Munich series for this episode, and it was really bloody good.
So you can find my current podcast at historyofthesecondworldwar.com. That's been going since about 2020, mid 2020. And then before that, I did History of the Great War, which started in 2014 and ran until 2020, which is the history of the Great War. I'm very bad at naming things. And that covers from 1914 to 1920-ish. And then History of the Great War, History of the Second World War is kind of a weekly podcast covering in a chronological order the history of the Second World War. What that means is I'm on episode 82 this week, and I have not yet gotten to September 1939. But that's how I roll.
Great, that sounds fantastic.
Massive undertaking,
yeah.
I like small projects.
So please, everyone, go listen to Wesley's podcast because it is really, really good. You'll learn a lot. So as always, thanks for listening. You can follow us on Twitter at Fighting on Film. Check out the website, fightingonfilm.com. The website now has a search bar, so you can look up to see if we've done a film or not. No more scrolling through the blog hoping to find something you want to listen to. You can now search. It's a miracle. And we'll catch you next time.
Thanks for joining us, Wesley, and thanks to everyone listening. Bye.
Bye now.